The 7-carat diamond bracelet on Marilyn Monroe's wrist felt like a cold chain tonight, weighing down the desperate woman beneath the shimmering facade. She was the most desired woman, yet when she fled the glittering Manhattan penthouse, she looked for a single honest moment that would cost everything but give her a life. The year was 1954. The jewels she wore sparkled with more life than she felt inside, and every flashbulb that popped was just another confirmation that the woman the world adored was not the one she saw in the mirror. Tonight, Marilyn Monroe was the diamond everyone wanted to touch, but deep down she was just Norma Jeane Mortenson, and she was desperately, unbearably alone. The penthouse apartment overlooking the entire glittering grid of Manhattan felt less like a home and more like a beautifully constructed cage. She moved through the room, accepting the adoration, the wine, and the empty promises, but her smile felt like glass, fragile and ready to shatter. The laughter echoing off the expensive walls was loud, but it could not drown out the profound silence that lived within her. She kept waiting for someone, anyone, to look past the platinum hair and the famous walk and see the trembling girl underneath. No one ever did. Even in the arms of the great Joe DiMaggio, the loneliness was an aching presence, a constant reminder that the character she played for the public had entirely consumed the person she truly was. She desperately needed to escape the weight of that perfect, manufactured performance. She slipped away quietly, an act of rebellion the studio publicists would have condemned as reckless. Her driver was waiting for the black Cadillac, but she waved him off with a quiet insistence, the voice of the movie star replaced by the small, sincere plea of a woman needing air. She wanted to drive herself. She needed to feel the cold metal of the steering wheel in her hands and the city air on her face, free from the judgments of the world and the expectations of the men who owned her image. She drove randomly, navigating the cold, damp November streets, searching for a silence that fame had made impossible. She was deeply exhausted by the sheer effort of being Marilyn Monroe. The diamond cluster earrings all felt like armor she was desperate to cast off. She needed to feel the chill of the real world on her skin, not the manufactured heat of the spotlight. The bright lights of the theater district faded behind her, replaced by shadows and grit of the industrial side of the city. Warehouses, loading docks, and quiet, unromantic corners where the real struggles of the city unfolded. Here, her name meant nothing. She was just another face in the dark, and that felt like the purest relief she had found all year. She pulled the trench coat tighter around her simple black dress, hoping the dark fabric would absorb her light and truly hide her. She was driving slowly, deliberately lost, looking for a simple, honest truth she could hold on to, a truth that could ground her amid the spectacle. She rounded a corner onto a narrow cobblestone street, lit only by a sputtering, weak street lamp. The silence here was different. It was not the silence of an empty movie set. It was the quiet of a forgotten corner of the world. She noticed the figure huddled against the rough brick wall of a closed diner. A shadow. A ghost. She should have kept driving. She should have gone back to her penthouse, where the world was safe and beautifully manufactured. But she saw something in that still, shadowed figure, something broken and alone that mirrored the vast emptiness inside her own heart. And against every instinct she had, she slowly brought the car to a halt. The silence of the industrial street was shattered only by the quiet ticking of the idling Cadillac engine, a sound of unimaginable luxury set against the backdrop of total human desperation. Marilyn sat, peering through the rain-streaked window, realizing that in this moment she had a choice. Drive away and return to the golden lie of Hollywood, or step out and face a truth she feared more than any tabloid headline. She felt an urgent, magnetic pull toward the lone figure. She pulled the silk scarf higher over her chin, attempting to cover the face that 20 million people recognized instantly, but the precaution felt ludicrous here. No one was looking for Marilyn Monroe on this forgotten corner of Manhattan at 3 o'clock in the morning. She wasn't an object of desire. She was a stranger. She opened the door, and the sound of the thick, heavy car door closing was a solid, unnatural thud in the stillness. She crossed the wet cobblestones, her high heels clicking a frantic rhythm that sounded like fear and nervous energy. The man was older than she first thought, perhaps in his late 30s, and his features were obscured by the shadow and the way his head rested against the cold brick. All she could distinguish was the frayed wool of the olive-drab army blanket wrapped around him, and the disciplined, almost military way his long legs were stretched out on the damp ground. He was simply enduring amidst profound need. This was the first time in years she had truly seen another person. She stood over him, suddenly feeling foolishly overdressed and embarrassingly wealthy. The man, Frank, stirred. His eyes opened slowly, not with alarm or surprise, but with the weary indifference of someone who had long ago ceased to expect anything good from the world. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her voice husky, unused to such a simple, sincere query. He blinked slowly. His gaze didn't flick to her famous platinum hair or her expensive coat. It looked directly into her eyes, searching her face for something only he knew how to find. "I'm fine, madam," he replied, his voice gravelly, but carrying the unmistakable echo of training and education. He made no movement to accept help or ask for anything. He treated her not as an idol, but as a passing acquaintance. This quiet disregard for her celebrity was profoundly disorienting. He offered nothing but the silent acknowledgement of her presence. And in that moment, she felt more like Norma Jeane than she had all night. She realized she wasn't looking at a nameless veteran. She was looking at a human being who had faced down harrowing dangers during conflict and returned home only to be forgotten by the very world he had protected. She was looking at the tragic price of the illusion she lived in, an illusion that celebrated superficiality while ignoring true sacrifice. She found herself wishing he would recognize her, just so she could perform the expected, easy gesture of charity. But he simply waited, silent, letting her own discomfort fill the enormous space between their two vastly different realities. The moment stretched, heavy and profound, until she felt compelled to break the silence once more. She reached into the pocket of her coat, pulling out a thick folded wad of currency, ready to throw money at the problem and soothe her own churning conscience. But as she extended her hand, the man's eyes met hers again, and she suddenly understood that this transaction was not going to be as simple as she hoped, and that the kind of help he needed was not the kind she had in her purse. The simplest currency Marilyn Monroe possessed was cash, and she assumed the solution to the veteran's plight would be just as simple, a handout that would ease her conscience and end the uncomfortable encounter. But the quiet dignity of the man named Frank was about to prove that Hollywood's easy answers had no place on a cold New York street corner. She pulled the folded wad of money from her coat pocket. It was several $100s, more than enough to buy him a warm room for weeks and a decent meal for days. "Here," she said, her voice soft but quick, wanting to close the transaction and retreat to the safety of her car. "Take this. You need it more than I do." She extended the cash, offering it not as charity, but as a nervous repayment for the glimpse of authenticity he had unknowingly given her. Frank's eyes did not move from hers, but his expression hardened almost imperceptibly, shedding the weariness and replacing it with something sharp and entirely unexpected. Pride. He slowly raised a gloved hand. The glove was worn thin, the fingers stiff, and gently pushed her hand away. "No, madam," he said. His voice was rough, like old sandpaper, but the refusal was firm and complete. "I appreciate the thought, truly, but I didn't ask for charity." The refusal hit her like a physical blow. She had never been refused, not like this, with such profound, quiet conviction. She was momentarily paralyzed, her star status utterly worthless. She felt her celebrity peeling away, leaving only the confused, insecure Norma Jeane standing on a wet cobblestone street. "But it's cold," she stammered, gesturing vaguely at the thin blanket and the brick wall. "You could get a room, get something to eat." Frank smiled then, a brief, tight movement of his lips that held no humor, only weary experience. "I know how to survive in harsh conditions, madam. That's one thing the army taught me well. And I didn't earn that money. It's not mine to take." He shifted his position, drawing the frayed blanket tighter around his shoulders. "I haven't been given a job, and I haven't begged for a penny. I've endured the consequences of my circumstances." His words struck at the very heart of her own shame. She too felt like she hadn't truly earned the endless wealth and fame that had been bestowed upon her. She had been given it, packaged and sold by others, and it often felt just as unearned. This man, with nothing, possessed an integrity that she, the world's most desired woman, could not buy. She knelt down a little, trying to reduce the enormous vertical distance that separated the star from the forgotten soldier. "What did you do?" she asked, setting aside the money, changing the subject completely. "Before this, before the army." Frank took a long breath, and the sound of it seemed heavy with untold memories. "Before the army, I was a plumber's apprentice in Brooklyn. After the army, well, after the conflict, I was a soldier. That's what they trained us to be. But the city, it doesn't need soldiers. Not the kind who are carrying heavy emotional burdens from the conflict. It needs plumbers and clerks and salesmen, things I couldn't learn to be again." He finally looked at the wad of cash lying uselessly on the damp pavement next to her feet. "Thank you, madam," he repeated, gentler this time. "But I need my dignity more than I need your dollars. If I take the easy way out tonight, I'll never be able to look at myself again." He wasn't asking for a handout. He was fighting to keep the last shred of himself whole. Marilyn realized the transaction had shifted entirely. She was the one seeking salvation here. She looked at the man, Frank, truly seeing the proud, broken spirit inside the shadow, and a sudden, fierce protectiveness surged through her. She was no longer trying to ease her guilt with money. She was meeting a profound, shared loneliness. She gently picked up the discarded money, tucking it away, knowing she had to offer something entirely different, something real and equally vulnerable, if she wanted him to speak the truth she desperately needed to hear. The cold refusal of her money was the key that unlocked the real conversation. If Frank wanted dignity, Marilyn would offer honesty, trading the unimaginable wealth of the world for a single, fragile moment of genuine human connection. She remained kneeling, the damp cold soaking through her thin silk stockings, something the real Marilyn Monroe would never tolerate. "You said you didn't want charity," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "You said you wanted dignity, but what if you lose it all? What if, one day, the whole world forgets you ever existed? What if the cameras stop flashing and the applause stops, and you realize you have nothing left?" She looked at him, not the icon, but the girl from the orphanage, the girl who had always feared being completely erased. "That's what I fear most," she confessed, "being forgotten." Frank studied her face, his gaze deep and searching. He saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror that gripped a soldier whose sacrifice goes unacknowledged, whose existence has been deemed expendable. He understood this fear perfectly. It was the same fear that haunted his own dark corner every night. He knew what it was like to be actively erased by the world he had fought to save. Frank shifted slightly, pushing himself up to lean more comfortably against the rough brick wall, a movement that suggested deep consideration. "When I came back from Europe," he began, his voice dropping low and heavy with the weight of history, "after we saw the devastation of battle, I lost everything. My family was gone, my job was gone, the veterans' benefits, the promises, they were nothing. I felt like the world owed me something. I wanted the parades, the thanks, the recognition." He paused, breathing deeply. "But the world doesn't care. It moves on. I spent a long time in profound sorrow, feeling cheated. I wanted someone else to fix me." He fixed his steady gaze back onto hers. "Then one night, the coldest night I'd ever felt, I realized I was waiting for the world to tell me I mattered. And I remembered what my commanding officer told me after a particularly difficult period of struggle, a truth that saved me from losing everything I had left. He told me, 'The worth is inside.'" Marilyn felt the words hit her like a punch to the stomach. They were so simple, so brutally true. The worth is inside. Not in the box office, not in the headlines, not in the applause, and certainly not in the cash she carried in her coat. The worth was inside. He had just handed her the key to her freedom, a truth worth more than her entire studio contract. She stood up quickly, the movement betraying her shock. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick, tears suddenly stinging her eyes. Not the manufactured tears of a studio scene, but real, raw grief over the years she had wasted searching for value externally, the years she had allowed herself to be empty. She turned abruptly, hurrying back across the wet cobblestones toward the idling Cadillac, leaving Frank alone in his shadow, a man who had changed the entire trajectory of her life with 4 simple, honest words. The Cadillac felt less like a vehicle of escape and more like a glass coffin as Marilyn drove through the pre-dawn streets. She could still hear the 4 words echoing in the silence of the expensive cabin, a truth bomb detonated in the carefully constructed fantasy of her life. The worth is inside. She eventually made it back to the Fifth Avenue penthouse, but the sight of the plush, silent rooms only amplified her distress. She walked past the telephone that constantly rang with demands and appointments, and she saw it all as utterly worthless. She realized that everything in her life, the contracts, the fame, the wealth, was designed to convince her that her worth was entirely outside. It was in her face, her figure, her performance. If she stopped performing, she ceased to exist. Frank, shivering on a cold street corner, had more integrity in his thin, frayed army blanket than she had in her entire wardrobe. She stood by the window, watching the city wake up, contemplating the years she had spent allowing herself to be packaged and sold, worried sick about every line, every wrinkle, every perceived flaw. Because if the external image failed, she believed the real Norma Jeane had nothing left. She had been searching for love and acceptance for millions, when she only needed to find it within. Frank's words were not a statement about his poverty. They were a profound commentary on her privilege. He had refused her money because taking it would invalidate the only thing he had left, the inner knowledge of his own value. He needed to be seen, not paid off. The impulse to send her assistant back with another, bigger sum of money was strong, the easiest way to soothe her conscience, but she violently suppressed it. That was the Marilyn solution, a quick, transactional fix. Norma Jeane knew better. Frank had not asked for charity. He had asked for dignity. To truly help him, she needed to restore his ability to earn his worth, to let him prove to himself that his value was still inside. She could not approach him as the celebrity again. That would strip him of the very self-respect he had fought so hard to preserve. She needed a ghost operation, an act of kindness so subtle, so carefully executed, that he would never know where it came from. She realized she could use her influence, not for her own gain, but to discreetly find the forgotten man named Frank, verify his honorable service, and plant the seeds of his recovery. This was not about clearing her conscience. It was about honoring the 4 words that had just saved her soul and allowing her to finally pursue her own worth. The sun rose over Manhattan, but for the first time in years, Marilyn wasn't looking toward the spotlight. She reached for the telephone, not to call her agent, but to call the one person she knew was fiercely loyal and utterly discreet, ready to launch a mission more important than any movie premiere. The most powerful machine in Hollywood was not the studio system or the gossip columnists. It was Marilyn Monroe's silent network of favors, and for the first time, she activated it not for fame or contract negotiation, but for one anonymous man named Frank. She called her most trusted, least visible contact, a man who specialized in making problems disappear and crucial information materialize. He didn't ask why she needed a discreet background check on a forgotten man in the garment district. He simply took the precise description of the quiet figure, the location, and the date. No paper trail and no call could ever lead back to Marilyn Monroe. Days later, a thick manila envelope was delivered not to her publicist, but to her private address. Marilyn tore it open, her hands shaking not from cold, but from anxiety. Inside, the documents confirmed everything, shattering the last vestiges of her Hollywood cynicism. Frank's full name was Francis O'Connell. He was a decorated veteran of the Italian campaign in World War II, a man who had earned his dignity in the brutal reality of the battlefield. The report detailed his courageous actions, the medals earned, and then the slow, agonizing decline after his honorable discharge. Francis had carried the emotional injuries of conflict home with him, Deep wounds the government refused to acknowledge or treat adequately. The complex, cruel bureaucratic red tape had caused his complete financial ruin, leaving him adrift and without the resources necessary to transition back to civilian life. He wasn't a person who lacked ambition. He was a good man, utterly overwhelmed by a system that celebrated him when he was useful and abandoned him when he was broken. A wave of profound, heartbroken sympathy washed over her. This was not a character in a movie. This was a national tragedy of American neglect. She folded the report carefully, now knowing exactly what to do. Money alone was still an insult to a man who valued his honor over survival. Francis needed an opportunity, a clear path back to earning his worth. She instructed her contact to begin phase 2, a quiet, untraceable push within the Veterans Administration, using high-level political connections to discover Francis's forgotten paperwork and clear the bureaucratic logjam. The goal was to make it seem as if the system, after years of delay, had finally corrected itself. Francis needed to believe his own struggle, his own persistence, had finally won the day. Marilyn would be nothing more than the invisible hand of fate. The intricate, secret machinery of Hollywood was now working not to create an illusion, but to repair a reality. Marilyn held the report to her chest, whispering Frank's full name, Francis O'Connell, a name she had never forgotten since the night he spoke those 4 simple words that had completely rearranged her soul. The bureaucracy that had relentlessly crushed Francis O'Connell for 5 long years suddenly began to move with uncanny, silent speed, not with the fanfare of a celebrity donation, but with the quiet precision of a well-aimed miracle designed by an untouchable source. The change began with a single, sealed envelope tucked discreetly into a drop box near the diner where Francis spent his days. It was an official communication, heavy with the seals of the Veterans Administration, detailing a forgotten clerical error related to his honorable discharge paperwork from World War II. Inside, a revised back pay calculation, a modest sum, but enough for a first month's deposit. More important, however, was the enclosed letter mentioning a new low-cost housing program for decorated veterans of the Italian campaign, a place where dignity could be rebuilt. The Veterans Administration bureaucracy, which had stubbornly resisted years of Francis's legitimate claims, suddenly yielded under high-level political pressure applied by Marilyn's secret contact, a lever pulled with surgical precision to mimic fate itself. Francis stared at the documents, his rough hands trembling slightly. His first immediate instinct was suspicion. Years of systematic neglect had taught him that the world did not operate on kindness, only on indifference or calculated debt. He searched the envelope, the letters, the forms for a name, a signature, a sponsor. There was none. It was simply the system, finally, belatedly, correcting itself. The true genius of Marilyn's plan was that the help was disguised as justice. Francis couldn't refuse justice. He could only accept what he had already earned years ago. He took the small amount of back pay and secured the room. It was small, but the light was reliable, the heat was steady, and the walls were clean. It was the first safe place he had occupied since landing on a transport ship 5 years prior. The ultimate gift arrived a week later, tucked into his mailbox. A notice for an interview with a large New York plumbing union, specifically seeking veterans with prior apprenticeship experience. The interview had been quietly set up by Marilyn's contact. The interview notice was the real turning point. It wasn't charity, it was a door, and he had to walk through it using his own strength. He spent 2 days preparing, polishing his few meager possessions, mentally rehearsing his forgotten apprenticeship knowledge. He bought a cheap second-hand suit with a portion of the back pay, and for the first time in years, Francis O'Connell looked in a cracked mirror and saw not a shadow, but a man with a purpose. He had been given nothing but the chance to earn his place, and that was everything. The 4 words, "The worth is inside," had allowed him to accept the external opportunity because the internal struggle had already been won. He was ready to fight for his dignity one last time. Marilyn, miles away, continued her glittering life, careful to keep the secret close to her heart. She often found herself driven that dark industrial route, never stopping, just watching from a safe distance, praying for a sign that her silent sacrifice had finally allowed dignity to find its way back to Frank. Weeks blurred into one another as Marilyn filmed on the bustling lot, but she could not forget the quiet corner of Manhattan where she had left her heart. She continued to perform, but now every smile felt heavier, every performance more difficult, because she knew the difference between the manufactured light of the camera and the honest light of a man fighting for his soul. One cold, clear morning, she instructed her driver to take the detour, holding her breath, terrified that the miracle she had orchestrated had failed and that Frank would be gone. The car idled near the same spot where the sputtering street lamp still stood, now dimmed by the strengthening morning sun. Marilyn pulled her coat up and peered through the window. The army blanket was gone. The shadow against the brick wall was empty. For one agonizing moment, her heart sank, convinced that the years of bureaucratic indifference had caused irreparable damage and that she had waited too long. Then, a figure emerged from a nearby doorway, walking toward the street. It was Frank, but not the Frank she knew. He wore simple, respectable working clothes, a thick shirt and trousers, and his shoes were tied tight, ready for a day of labor. The heavy old toolbox he carried was the only badge of honor he needed. He wasn't just walking, he was marching, shoulders back, carrying the toolbox with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going and what he was worth. The transformation was profound, immediate, and breathtaking. His face, though still bearing the scars of past struggles, was alight with purpose, the true worth shining through. Marilyn leaned back against the leather seat, unable to stop the sudden, profound rush of relief and overwhelming joy. Tears streamed down her face, not the weeping of sorrow, but the profound, cathartic release of a woman who had finally been part of something genuinely good and lasting. She felt the tears track down her cheek in slow motion, marking the end of her own internal suffering. She watched him stop briefly, look up at the morning sky, a moment of silent gratitude, and then step onto a city bus, heading downtown toward work. He was a productive, self-respecting man again, all because she had honored his 4 simple words. Her driver, sensitive to the silent drama unfolding in the back seat, asked quietly if she wanted to stop. Marilyn shook her head immediately. "No," she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. "We don't stop. He doesn't need Marilyn Monroe." To reveal herself now, to demand recognition or even gratitude, would be the greatest insult. It would suggest that his hard-won victory belonged to her. But his victory was his own. She had only provided the opportunity. The worth was inside, and now it was out in the world, doing honest work. She realized that the anonymous, powerful act of helping him find dignity had given her more genuine self-worth than any standing ovation she had ever received in her entire life. Marilyn watched the bus pull away until it was just a tiny spot of yellow disappearing into the morning traffic. She knew then that the glitter of Hollywood would never blind her again, because the simple, honest truth she saw restored on. That cold street corner would forever be the foundation of the woman she would strive to become. The encounter lasted less than 30 minutes on a forgotten street corner, but it was a shift so profound that those closest to Marilyn Monroe recognized a fundamental, irreversible change in her soul that no script or director could have ever manufactured. On the set of Bus Stop in 1955, she was still fighting for better roles and demanding control over her image. But now the fight was rooted not in insecurity, but in genuine self-worth. She would hold their gaze with a new, unwavering certainty. Her internal mantra, "The worth is inside," gave her a shield against the casual disrespect and exploitation of Hollywood. She demanded to be seen as an artist with depth, not just an ornament on the screen. The old Marilyn had sought validation. The new Marilyn demanded respect. She started turning down glamorous, hollow projects, seeking roles with genuine, flawed human depth. The most profound change was visible in her personal endeavors. She began a series of anonymous donations, quiet grants to veterans assistance programs, and small foundations helping people rebuild their lives and dignity. She never attached her name. She simply directed her trusted contact to ensure the money went where it was needed most, perfectly mimicking the ghost operation she had performed for Frances O'Connell. It was not philanthropy for the cameras. It was a private atonement for the immense privilege she carried. Even through the turbulent emotional storms of her public life, the divorce from Joe, the marriage to Arthur Miller, the secret of Frances O'Connell remained her grounding force. When the spotlight felt blinding or the demands felt crushing, she would silently repeat the mantra, finding an oasis of calm within the chaos. She had chosen anonymity for Frank, and in doing so, she had found her own truest self, the self that was not fragile but resolute. She had learned that the most important audience was always the one she saw in the mirror. She continued to look for ways to subtly help those who felt invisible, sending small, untraceable gifts and opportunities to struggling people whose dignity had been chipped away by hardship. This was Marilyn's secret legacy, a history of silent, powerful action that constantly contradicted the loud, fragile image she projected to the world. She carried the quiet weight of Frank's story, a secret that made her feel more grounded and more human than all the fame and fortune in the world ever could. The world only saw the tragedy and the turmoil of the star, never the bedrock of quiet moral conviction that lay underneath. It would take many years and a final, heartbreaking act of historical preservation for the world to learn that Marilyn Monroe had left behind the quietest, most sincere testament to the 4 words that had finally saved her soul. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe's life overshadowed everything she ever did, but decades later, the silent key to her most profound personal transformation was finally discovered in a plain, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, the intimate ink faded slightly with time. The binding itself felt heavy with secrets. After Marilyn's passing, her most personal effects, her books, her letters, and her private journals were carefully catalogued. The journals, filled with elegant handwriting and deeply intimate reflections, were where Norma Jeane truly lived. They contained the private grief and the quiet hopes she hid from the world. Among the reflections on her poetry classes and the heartache of her volatile career, There was one entry, penned in 1955, shortly after she made the revolutionary and terrifying decision to break her restrictive studio contract and seize control of her own image. "I looked into his eyes and saw the truth of my own emptiness," the entry began. "He had nothing, yet he possessed everything, his own internal worth. I have everything, and I possess nothing at all, because I have allowed them to own my value." She credited the quiet dignity of the man she helped anonymously for giving her the strength to take the most terrifying and important step of her professional life. "He gave me what the studio never could, a compass. Today, I left the cage. I will not be bought anymore. I will fight to be an artist, because 4 simple words whispered on a street corner taught me that the external price means nothing compared to the courage of the internal truth." The 4 words were written just below, underscored multiple times, serving as the final, profound key to her last years of struggle and defiance. The worth is inside. The world had obsessed over her beauty, her clothes, her drama, but the journal entry confirmed that the single most important event of her later life was not a movie premiere or a marriage, but a 30-minute encounter with a man the world had thrown away. Marilyn Monroe stopped for Francis O'Connell, not because he needed her money, but because she desperately needed his truth. She used her massive, blinding influence to restore the dignity of one invisible person, and in doing so, she gave herself the courage to demand a life lived authentically. We live in a world obsessed with public gestures and viral acts of charity. But Marilyn's greatest achievement, revealed quietly years after she was gone, was the invisible, profound power of genuine connection. She drove away that night having received a gift greater than gold, the courage to seek her own true self, the self that existed outside the frame of the camera lens. And Francis O'Connell, who finally found his dignity on a New York street, never knew that the silent help he received was Marilyn Monroe's final, greatest love letter to the possibility of a life truly lived. The story of Francis O'Connell and 4 words that changed Marilyn's life proves the greatest. Human worth is found in places the spotlight ignores. If this invisible act of profound kindness touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another story about the true human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends.